Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a story that's haunted the human imagination for over 2,000 years. Not the clear-cut facts of archaeology textbooks, but something murkier, more tantalizing. Something that sits in that peculiar space between history and dream. You won't find definitive answers here, no triumphant discovery at the end. Just the long, winding tale of humanity's most persistent mystery, and the strange comfort that comes from not quite solving it. If this kind of storytelling helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's oddly reassuring to know who else is falling asleep to the same ancient enigma. So dim the lights. Let your mind wander to distant shores and sunken cities. Settle in, and let's begin with the story of Atlantis. The weight of a name. There are names that echo through time with a particular kind of resonance. Atlantis is one of them. Say it aloud, and something shifts in the room. It's a word that carries salt spray and stone ruins, ancient wisdom and catastrophic endings. For more than 2 millennia, this single name has launched 1,000 expeditions, inspired countless books, and occupied the thoughts of everyone from philosophers to crackpots, from genuine scholars to hopeful dreamers convinced they've finally found it. The search for Atlantis has taken people to every continent, every ocean, every promising island chain or suspicious underwater formation. And still, the mystery endures. What makes Atlantis different from other lost civilizations is this: we know exactly where the story begins. There's no murky prehistory, no oral tradition passed down through generations until its origins blur into the mists. Atlantis springs fully formed from the mind of one man, writing in Athens around 360 years before the Common Era. That man was Plato, arguably the most influential philosopher who ever lived. And the story he told, almost as an aside in 2 of his dialogues, would outlive everything else he wrote in the popular imagination. It would spawn libraries of speculation, scientific expeditions, archaeological digs, and an entire genre of fringe theories. It would become a cultural touchstone, a metaphor, a warning, and a promise all at once. But here's what makes it stranger still. Plato wasn't writing history. He was writing philosophy. The tale of Atlantis appears in works concerned with ideal governments, cosmic creation, and the nature of reality itself. The lost city is introduced not as the main event, but as an example, an illustration, almost a footnote. And yet, that footnote has echoed louder and longer than the actual points Plato was trying to make. The student's question has become more famous than the teacher's answer. The metaphor has escaped the page and taken on a life of its own, growing wilder and more detailed with each retelling, until it's almost impossible to see the original story beneath the centuries of embellishment. So, why does it persist? Why, when we have real ancient cities to excavate and real mysteries to solve, do we keep returning to this particular fiction? Perhaps because Atlantis offers something those real ruins cannot. It offers perfection, followed by catastrophe. It offers the dream of an advanced civilization that solved all the problems we still struggle with, then lost everything in a single day. It offers a warning about hubris wrapped in the promise that such heights are possible. It tells us that humanity has been greater than it is now, and might be again. It's the mythic structure we can't resist: paradise, fall, and the faint hope of rediscovery. Atlantis is not just a lost city, it's a lost possibility. And that's a far more seductive thing to search for than mere stones and pottery. Tonight, we're going to trace the entire story, from Plato's original telling to the modern theories that place Atlantis everywhere from Antarctica to Bolivia. We'll walk through the details of the island itself, explore the civilization that supposedly thrived there, examine the reasons for its destruction, and follow the strange journey of how this tale spread through history. We'll look at the most compelling theories about where it might have been, if it was anywhere at all. And we'll try to understand why, after all these centuries, we're still looking. Because the search for Atlantis isn't really about finding a sunken city. It's about something deeper, something that touches on who we are and what we're afraid of becoming. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to go back to where it all started, to a middle-aged philosopher in ancient Athens putting words into the mouth of his teacher as he tried to describe the ideal state. Plato's tale, the original account. The story of Atlantis comes to us from two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. Both were written around 360 years before the Common Era, near the end of Plato's life. To understand them, you need to understand their context. They're not standalone adventure stories. They're part of a philosophical project, a continuation of ideas Plato had been developing for decades about the nature of ideal government and human society. The Timaeus is primarily concerned with the creation of the universe, the nature of the cosmos, and the relationship between the physical and the divine. The Critias, which is actually unfinished, was meant to be a more detailed account of Athens and Atlantis in conflict. Together, they form a strange hybrid, part cosmology, part political theory, part adventure tale. The dialogues take place the day after Socrates has described his vision of an ideal state. This is a reference to Plato's most famous work, The Republic, where he laid out his vision of a perfectly ordered society. Now, in the Timaeus, Socrates expresses a wish. He'd like to see this ideal state in action, to watch it deal with real challenges and real conflicts. It's a request for the theory to be tested against something reality. And this is where Critias, one of the other characters in the dialogue, steps forward with a story. Critias explains that he heard this tale when he was about 10 years old from his grandfather, who was also named Critias. The grandfather, in turn, had heard it from his own grandfather, a man named Dropidides, who heard it directly from Solon, one of Athens's most revered lawmakers and poets. Solon, the story goes, traveled to Egypt around 600 years before the Common Era. There, in the city of Sais, he met with priests who had access to records far more ancient than anything the Greeks possessed. These priests told Solon a remarkable story about Athens itself, about a great war fought 9,000 years before Plato's time, and about a powerful empire that had threatened all the Mediterranean peoples. Now, right away, there are problems with this chain of transmission. The timeline doesn't quite work if you calculate the generations carefully. Some scholars think Plato deliberately made the timeline impossible, a subtle signal that this is fiction. Others think he simply didn't worry too much about making the dates align perfectly, because that wasn't the point. Regardless, this is how Plato frames it, as an ancient story, preserved in Egyptian records, passed down through family memory, and now being retold in Athens to illustrate a philosophical point. It's given just enough historical texture to feel real, while remaining just vague enough to be unprovable. The Egyptian priests tell Solon that the Greeks are like children when it comes to remembering their own history. The Greeks, they explain, keep getting their records destroyed by floods, fires, and other catastrophes. Every time civilization rebuilds itself, it forgets what came before. But Egypt, protected by the Nile's regular flooding patterns, has maintained continuous records stretching back thousands of years. And in those records is the story of ancient Athens, a city far more glorious than the Athens of Solon's or Plato's time. This ancient Athens was, by the priest's account, the ideal state brought to life. It had wise laws, brave warriors, skilled artisans, and a government based on virtue rather than power or wealth. It was, in other words, suspiciously similar to the ideal state Socrates had just finished describing. But this ancient Athens faced a terrible threat. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar, there was an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. This was Atlantis. It was ruled by kings who traced their lineage back to Poseidon himself, the god of the sea. These kings had conquered much of the western Mediterranean and parts of Africa and Europe. They controlled vast territories, commanded powerful armies and navies, and grew wealthy beyond imagination. And now they turned their attention eastward, toward Greece and Egypt and all the lands of the eastern Mediterranean. It was a war of empires, the great naval power of the West against the land power of the East. Athens, according to the story, stood alone. Other Greek cities fell away, either conquered or intimidated into submission. But the Athenians fought on, leading the resistance against Atlantean expansion. In a series of battles, they pushed back the invaders, defeated their forces, and liberated the conquered territories. It was Athens's finest hour, a demonstration of what a truly virtuous state could accomplish when faced with overwhelming odds. The small, well-ordered city triumphed over the vast, wealthy empire. Virtue defeated vice. Order defeated chaos. But then came the catalysm. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, both the Athenian army and the entire island of Atlantis disappeared. The warriors of Athens were swallowed by the earth. Atlantis sank beneath the waves. And the story itself was nearly lost, surviving only in Egyptian records, waiting thousands of years for Solon to come along and carry it back to Greece. The sea where Atlantis had been became unnavigable, choked with mud from the sunken island. The glory of ancient Athens faded from memory. Both victor and vanquished were erased, leaving only this tale as testimony to what had been. That's the basic story as Plato tells it in the Timaeus, delivered in broad strokes as part of a larger dialogue about the cosmos. It's fascinating, certainly, but brief. Most of the dialogue concerns itself with other matters, with the creation of the world and the nature of the soul and the mathematics of cosmic harmony. Atlantis is an illustration, an example, a story told to make a point about virtue and power. But then Plato returns to it, or starts to, in the dialogue called the Critias. Here, the character Critias promises to provide more details about both ancient Athens and Atlantis. He begins to describe the island in rich, specific detail, and then, frustratingly, the text breaks off. The dialogue is unfinished. We don't know why. Perhaps Plato died before completing it. Perhaps he abandoned the project because he felt the philosophical point had been made. Perhaps the ending is lost to time. Whatever the reason, we're left with a detailed description of Atlantis, but no conclusion to the story, no final confrontation, no last words from Zeus about the punishment of the Atlanteans. And so the tale of Atlantis comes to us incomplete, given to us as ancient history, but written as philosophy, described in vivid detail, but left without an ending. It's a strange gift, this story, specific enough to feel real, vague enough to resist verification, compelling enough to inspire centuries of searching, and ambiguous enough to support almost any interpretation. Plato gives us just enough to fire the imagination, then stops, leaving the rest to us. The island itself, geography of the impossible. Now let's turn to the island itself, as Plato describes it through the voice of Critias. Because while the story of Atlantis and ancient Athens is brief and somewhat vague, the description of the island is remarkably, almost obsessively detailed. Plato, or rather his character Critias, spends paragraph after paragraph describing the geography, the layout of the capital city, the arrangement of the land, the natural resources, the infrastructure. It's this level of detail that has convinced so many people through history that Atlantis must have been real. Fiction, they reason, doesn't need this much specificity. Plato must have been working from some kind of source, some actual place that inspired the description. Of course, that logic cuts both ways. A skilled fiction writer knows that detail sells a lie. The more specific you are, the more real something feels, even if it's entirely invented. According to the Critias, the island of Atlantis was allotted to Poseidon when the gods divided the world among themselves. On this island lived a man named Evenor and his wife Leucippe, and they had a daughter, Cleito. When Cleito's parents died, Poseidon fell in love with her. To protect her, he reshaped the hill where she lived, creating a distinctive formation. Alternating rings of land and water. 2 rings of land separated by 3 rings of water, all centered on the hilltop where Cleito dwelt. This became the heart of the Atlantean capital, a natural fortress made by a god's power. Poseidon and Cleito had 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins. The eldest was named Atlas, and it's from him that both the island and the ocean took their names. Poseidon divided Atlantis into 10 portions, giving each son a territory to rule. Atlas, as the eldest, received the central portion, the hilltop surrounded by its concentric rings of land and water, and he became the high king over his brothers. The kingship would pass from Atlas to his firstborn son, then to that son's firstborn, maintaining the line of succession for many generations. And, according to the story, this arrangement worked. For a long time, perhaps hundreds of years, the descendants of Atlas ruled Atlantis justly and well. The island itself was large, Plato tells us, larger than Libya and Asia combined. Now, in ancient Greek geography, Libya meant North Africa, and Asia meant Anatolia, roughly modern-day Turkey. So we're talking about an island of truly enormous proportions, something on the scale of a small continent. It was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which everyone agrees was the Strait of Gibraltar, out in the Atlantic Ocean. The island was mountainous in the north, with cliffs rising from the sea, but it opened into a large plain on the southern side. This plain was rectangular, smooth, and level, surrounded by mountains that protected it from the northern winds. Now we come to the capital city, and here Plato's description becomes almost architectural in its precision. Remember those concentric rings Poseidon created around Cleito's hill? The Atlanteans, over generations, turned that natural formation into an engineered marvel. They carved tunnels through the rings of land, creating passages large enough for ships to sail through from the outer ocean all the way to the central island. They built bridges over the rings of water, connecting the bands of land. They constructed walls around each ring, covering them with metal. The outermost wall was coated with brass, the middle wall with tin, and the innermost wall, surrounding the citadel itself, with orichalcum, a precious metal that Plato describes as glinting like fire in the sun. Orichalcum is one of those tantalizing details. The name means something like mountain copper in Greek, and in Plato's time it referred to a real alloy, probably brass or possibly a copper-zinc mixture that had a golden color. But Plato describes it as having been mined on Atlantis and as being incredibly valuable, second only to gold. In later centuries, orichalcum would take on almost mystical properties in the retellings, becoming a lost metal that no one quite knows how to reproduce. It's one of the many ways the story has grown beyond Plato's original telling, a single detail expanding into a whole mythology of its own. The central island, where Poseidon's temple stood, was 5 stades in diameter. A stade is about 600 feet, so we're talking about a circle roughly half a mile across. On this island stood 2 great temples, one dedicated to Poseidon and Clito, the other used for royal ceremonies and gatherings. The temple of Poseidon was particularly magnificent. Plato describes it as having walls covered in silver, with decorations of gold on the outside. Inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon riding a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head nearly touched the temple ceiling, surrounded by 100 nereids riding dolphins. The whole space was filled with golden statues dedicated by kings throughout the generations. The palace complex occupied much of this central island, with gardens, springs of both hot and cold water, baths, and exercise grounds. The hot springs, which flowed naturally from the earth, were a particular luxury. They channeled some of this water to a grove sacred to Poseidon, where trees grew to extraordinary size thanks to the quality of the soil and water. The cold water springs fed fountains and baths and were used for general drinking. Everything was designed to serve the comfort and pleasure of the royal family and their court. Moving outward from the central island, each ring of land had its own purpose. The first ring contained facilities for the royal guard, an elite force personally loyal to the kings. The second ring housed the bulk of the military forces, with barracks and training grounds. The outermost ring, closest to the sea, was a teeming commercial zone, where merchants and sailors and craftsmen lived and worked. A great harbor was built here, connected to the outer ocean by a channel large enough for the largest ships. The harbor was always full, Plato tells us, with ships from all over the known world, creating constant noise and activity day and night. Beyond the city itself, extending across the Great Plain, was an enormous agricultural region. This plain was rectangular, 3,000 stades long and 2,000 stades wide, dimensions that work out to roughly 220 miles by 140 miles. It was one of the most fertile regions in the world, protected by mountains, irrigated by an astonishing system of canals. These canals were straight, running parallel to each other across the entire plain, 100 feet wide and 100 feet deep, all connecting to a great circular canal that surrounded the plain's entire perimeter. This circular canal was an engineering marvel, allowing ships to travel from any part of the plain to the city itself. The plain was divided into 60,000 lots, each one a perfect square of 100 stades to a side. Each lot was required to supply a certain number of soldiers and support staff for military campaigns: 1 chariot, 2 mounted warriors, 2 hoplites or heavy infantry, 2 slingers, 3 stone throwers, 3 javelin men, 4 sailors, and various support personnel. Do the math on 60,000 lots, and you get an army of staggering size, hundreds of thousands of men, more soldiers than most Greek city-states had citizens. It's another detail that strains belief, that makes you wonder whether Plato is describing a real place or deliberately exaggerating to make a point about the scale and power of this empire. The natural resources of the island were equally impressive. Atlantis had 2 harvests per year, Plato tells us, one from the winter rains and one from irrigation in summer. The island produced everything a civilization could need: timber from extensive forests, minerals from rich mines, game from wild lands, crops from the cultivated plain, and fish from the surrounding seas. That precious orichalcum was mined from beneath the earth in many parts of the island. There were both domesticated animals and wild beasts, including, Plato mentions specifically, elephants. That single detail, elephants, has caused endless speculation. Where could there have been elephants in the Atlantis? It's one of many clues that Atlantis, if it existed at all, couldn't have been where Plato said it was. The Atlanteans built extensively in stone, quarrying both white and black rock from beneath the central island's rings, so that the tunnels and mines themselves served as docks for ships sheltered beneath the earth. They used these stones to build not just the capital city, but towns and temples and fortifications all across the island. They mastered the arts of architecture and engineering, creating bridges and aqueducts and defensive walls that should have made them invulnerable. They developed advanced agricultural techniques, sophisticated naval technology, and a complex bureaucracy to manage their vast territories. In Plato's description, Atlantis was more than just a powerful nation. It was a wonder of the ancient world, a place where nature's gifts and human ingenuity combined to create something that shouldn't have been possible. And that, perhaps, is the point. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, is too perfect, too ordered, too precisely described. The dimensions are suspiciously neat, perfect rectangles, perfect circles, everything arranged in rational patterns. It reads less like a description of a real place, with all the messy irregularity that real geography entails, and more like an architectural plan, an ideal city laid out on paper. It's the kind of place a philosopher might design as an illustration of how a state should be organized. Everything has its place. Everything serves a purpose. The military rings surrounding the royal center. The vast agricultural plain feeding the city. The sophisticated infrastructure connecting it all together. It's not just a description of power. It's a diagram of empire, showing how resources and organization and strategic planning combine to create dominance. And like all diagrams, it's cleaner and more perfect than reality ever manages to be. But that perfection, that impossible precision, is part of what makes Atlantis so compelling. It presents itself as something that could be found, if only we looked in the right place, measured carefully enough, dug deep enough into the ocean floor. Now, let's talk about the people who lived in this extraordinary place. Because a city, no matter how magnificently designed, is just stone and metal and water, without the civilization that inhabits it. And according to Plato, the civilization of Atlantis was, at least initially, something remarkable. For many generations after Poseidon divided the island among his 10 sons, the Atlanteans remained true to their divine heritage. They governed with wisdom. They pursued virtue over wealth. They maintained justice throughout their territories. They were, in essence, living examples of Plato's ideal state, putting philosophical principles into practice on a massive scale. The government of Atlantis was a unique hybrid, part monarchy, part confederation. Each of the 10 kings ruled his own portion of the island with absolute authority. Within his own territory, a king was sovereign. He made the laws, dispensed justice, commanded the military forces, and managed resources as he saw fit. But the kings were also bound together by ancient laws, supposedly given to them by Poseidon himself, laws that govern their relationships with each other and establish the rules for collective decisions affecting all of Atlantis. These laws were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple of Poseidon at the center of the capital. Every 5 to 6 years, the 10 kings would gather at this temple for a sacred ritual. They would hunt the bulls that roamed freely within the temple precincts, using only wooden staffs and ropes, no weapons permitted. When they captured a bull, they would lead it to the orichalcum pillar and sacrifice it there, allowing its blood to flow over the inscription of Poseidon's laws. Then, as night fell, they would make burnt offerings and swear oaths of loyalty to each other and to the laws inscribed on the pillar. They would judge any disputes that had arisen between the kingdoms since the last gathering, and they would vote on any collective actions, always deciding by majority rule among the 10. The whole ritual emphasized unity, shared purpose, sacred duty. It was designed to prevent the kings from fighting each other or pursuing selfish ends at the expense of the whole. For many generations, this system worked. The kings remained devoted to virtue rather than vice. They bore their great wealth lightly, Plato tells us, not becoming corrupted by it. They valued wisdom and friendship and mutual goodwill more than material possessions. They understood that these qualities were the foundation of prosperity, and that prosperity pursued for its own sake would eventually poison those qualities. So they lived well, but not extravagantly, governed justly, maintained their alliances, and gradually expanded their influence across the Western Mediterranean and beyond. The Atlantean society that flourished under this leadership was sophisticated and multi-layered. At the top sat the royal families, descendants of Atlas and his brothers, maintaining their sacred bloodlines through careful marriages and succession practices. Below them was an aristocracy of landowners and military commanders, the class that supplied those 2 mounted warriors and chariots from each of the 60,000 lots on the plain. Then came the professional classes, the engineers who maintained the canals, the architects who designed the buildings, the priests who tended the temples, the merchants who managed trade with foreign lands, the captains who commanded the war fleet. Below them were the craftsmen and artisans, the people whose labor built the great monuments and whose skills produced the wealth that made Atlantis prosper. Stonemasons and metal workers, potters and weavers, shipbuilders and chariot makers, jewelers and perfumers, all the skilled trades that a complex civilization requires. And at the base of the pyramid, though Plato says little about them, must have been a vast population of farmers and laborers, the people who actually worked those 60,000 lots, who dug and maintained the canals, who harvested the double crops each year, who provided the food and basic materials that supported everyone else. Trade was the lifeblood of Atlantean prosperity. The great harbor never slept, Plato tells us. Ships arrived constantly from territories both near and far, bringing exotic goods and raw materials, leaving with Atlantean products and manufacturers. The Atlanteans controlled trade routes across their vast empire, extracting wealth from territories in Africa and Europe, and the islands scattered across the seas. They had colonies and outposts and subject peoples who paid tribute and provided soldiers. The scope of this trade network was enormous, probably comparable to that of any empire in the ancient Mediterranean world. Technology seems to have been particularly advanced. The engineering of those concentric rings and canals alone suggests sophisticated mathematical and construction capabilities. The ability to tunnel through solid rock, to create those ship passages, to build bridges strong enough to handle constant traffic, to maintain such an extensive irrigation system across the Great Plain. All of this implies knowledge and techniques that would have been impressive by any standard. The metallurgy was advanced too, at least if we take the descriptions of orichalcum seriously. And the military technology must have been formidable, given that Atlantis built an empire stretching across the western Mediterranean. Religion played a central role in Atlantean life, as it did in most ancient societies. The temple of Poseidon dominated the capital, a constant reminder of the divine ancestry the kings claimed. But there were other temples too, shrines to various gods spread across the island. The regular gathering of the kings for the bull sacrifice was just one of many rituals that marked the calendar year. There would have been seasonal festivals, harvest celebrations, ceremonies for births and marriages and deaths among the royal families, public sacrifices and private devotions. Religion wasn't separate from civic life. It was woven through every aspect of society, providing the moral framework that supposedly kept the Atlanteans virtuous for so long. The military forces of Atlantis were impressive in their organization and scale. Remember those numbers Plato gives for each lot of land? Specific quotas of chariots, cavalry, infantry, archers, sailors. This suggests not just a large army, but a highly organized one, with standardized equipment and training, clear chains of command, detailed logistics for feeding and moving all those troops. The Navy must have been particularly powerful, given that Atlantis was an island empire that controlled sea routes and coastal territories. The harbor could accommodate vast numbers of ships. The sophistication of tunnel and bridge construction suggests they were skilled at military engineering as well. Education in Atlantis, though Plato doesn't describe it directly, must have been extensive, at least for the upper classes. You don't build cities like that, don't maintain such an empire, without a class of educated administrators and skilled professionals. There would have been schools for the children of aristocrats, training in military arts for young nobles, apprenticeships for craftsmen, some system of literacy for record-keeping and law. The knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, geography, and navigation that such a civilization required would have been passed down through formal and informal means, creating an educated elite capable of running a complex state. Art and culture would have flourished too, because they always do in wealthy, confident civilizations. The golden statues in Poseidon's temple, the architectural beauty of the royal palace, the decorative metalwork on the great walls, all of this suggests a society that valued aesthetic achievement alongside practical success. There would have been poets and musicians, storytellers and historians, artists working in bronze and gold and precious stones. The very act of inscribing Poseidon's laws on a pillar of orichalcum was partly practical, partly artistic, a marriage of function and beauty that characterizes the best of ancient civilizations. For generations, perhaps centuries, this civilization thrived. The kings followed their oaths. The laws were maintained. The empire expanded but didn't overreach. Wealth increased but didn't corrupt. It was a golden age, that impossible period when everything worked, when virtue and success reinforced each other rather than coming into conflict. The Atlanteans were blessed by their divine ancestry, by their island's natural abundance, by their strategic position controlling the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. They were powerful, prosperous, and proud. And according to Plato, that pride would eventually become their undoing. Because no golden age lasts forever, and the higher a civilization rises, the further it has to fall. The fall from virtue to vice. Every story of paradise contains within it the seeds of paradise lost. Atlantis is no exception. In Plato's telling, the catastrophic end of Atlantis wasn't random. It wasn't a natural disaster that struck without warning or reason. It was a punishment, divine judgment for a moral failing that grew slowly, generation by generation, until it could no longer be ignored. The story of Atlantis's fall is ultimately a story about corruption, about how prosperity and power can poison the very virtues that created them in the first place. For many generations, Plato tells us, the divine nature was strong in the Atlanteans. They were descendants of Poseidon, after all, and that divine blood kept them true to their principles. They despised everything except virtue. They bore their wealth and power lightly, as temporary blessings rather than permanent possessions. They saw clearly that goodness and fellowship and mutual respect were the foundations of prosperity, and that pursuing wealth for its own sake would eventually undermine those foundations. This wisdom kept them virtuous, and their virtue kept them prosperous, and the cycle reinforced itself generation after generation. But divine blood, mixed with mortal blood, grows weaker with each passing generation. The ratio shifts. The human nature becomes stronger, the divine nature weaker. And human nature, at least in Plato's philosophy, tends towards certain flaws: greed, ambition, pride, the desire for more than one has, the conviction that one deserves more than others. These tendencies were always present in the Atlanteans, but for a long time they were held in check by that divine nature, by the wisdom and self-control that came from their connection to Poseidon. As that connection weakened, the restraints weakened too. The change must have been gradual, probably imperceptible from one generation to the next. A king makes a decision based more on advantage than on justice. Another king ignores a tradition because it's inconvenient. An oath is bent, not quite broken. Laws are interpreted loosely when strict interpretation would limit the king's authority. Wealth accumulation becomes something to boast about rather than bear lightly. Luxury increases. The gap between the wealthy and the poor widens. Military power, once a means of defense and maintaining order, starts to become an end in itself, something to be used for expansion and domination rather than justice. To anyone observing from the inside, these changes might have seemed like progress. The empire was expanding. Wealth was increasing. Atlantean influence spread across more and more territories. Why question success? Why worry about abstract principles of virtue when everything seems to be going so well? But to someone with eyes to see, to someone guided by wisdom rather than blind to prosperity, the signs of decay were unmistakable. The Atlanteans were becoming corrupted by their own success. They were beginning to believe they deserved their wealth and power, that it was theirs by right, that they could use it however they pleased without consequence. Zeus, the king of the gods, saw what was happening. Zeus, who governs with law and can see into such things, recognized that an honorable race was in a wretched state. Not wretched in their circumstances, but wretched in their souls, in the growing gap between what they were and what they should have been. And being the god of justice, Zeus decided to inflict punishment, both to make them pay for their transgressions and to chasten them, to teach them through suffering what they had refused to learn through wisdom. This is where Plato's account frustratingly breaks off. The Critias dialogue ends with Zeus calling together all the gods to his dwelling place at the center of the world, seeing all things that partake of generation. He calls them together to speak about the Atlanteans and what must be done. And then, nothing. The text ends. We never hear what Zeus said. We never see the actual destruction unfold. We only know from the earlier summary in the Timaeus what happened. Violent earthquakes and floods. A single day and night of catastrophe. The Atlantean army and the ancient Athenian forces both swallowed up. The island itself sinking into the ocean. But even without the detailed narration of the end, we can understand the structure of the story. This is a fall from grace, a pattern as old as storytelling itself. The blessed people, given every advantage, who slowly become corrupted by pride and forget the virtues that earned them those blessings in the first place. The divine punishment that comes not as arbitrary cruelty, but as inevitable consequence, as the universe restoring balance, as justice finally catching up with transgression. It's the same pattern you see in the story of the Garden of Eden, in the Greek myth of the Golden Age giving way to the ages of silver and bronze and iron, in the Tower of Babel and 100 other tales. The specific crime of Atlantis seems to be hubris, that peculiarly Greek concept that means something like arrogant pride, overstepping your proper bounds, forgetting your place in the cosmic order. The Atlanteans forgot they were mortal. They forgot their prosperity came from divine blessing, not from their own inherent superiority. They started acting like they were entitled to rule over others, entitled to expand their empire indefinitely, entitled to use their power without restraint. And hubris in Greek thought always brings nemesis, divine retribution, the gods striking down those who flew too high. But there's a political dimension to this moral tale that's easy to miss. Remember, Plato is using Atlantis as a contrast to his ideal Athens. The Atlanteans represent wealth, naval power, expansion, empire. They're everything Plato worried about in the Athens of his own time, the Athens that had pursued empire during the Peloponnesian War and suffered catastrophic defeat. The Atlantean Empire, in Plato's telling, becomes corrupt precisely because it becomes imperial, because it stops governing for the good of its own people and starts ruling over others for its own benefit. The wealth and power that flow from that imperialism corrupt the virtues that made them powerful in the first place. It's a warning, not subtle, about the dangers of empire, about what happens when a state becomes strong enough to dominate its neighbors and starts to believe that might makes right. The destruction when it came was absolute, not gradual decline, not slow collapse, but sudden catastrophe. In one day and night, earthquakes and floods, the earth itself rebelling against the corruption that walked upon it, the sea rising up to reclaim what had been land. The armies of both Atlantis and ancient Athens swallowed up, the warriors consumed by the earth, the island sinking beneath the waves. It was thorough, decisive, and final. Atlantis didn't leave ruins to explore or survivors to tell the tale directly. It simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the story itself, preserved in Egyptian records and eventually carried back to Greece by Solon. And perhaps that's the most interesting aspect of the story. The punishment doesn't distinguish between the good Athens and the bad Atlantis. Both are destroyed. The virtuous warriors who fought against Atlantean imperialism are consumed along with the corrupt imperialists themselves. It's a strangely nihilistic ending for what seems like a moral tale. You might expect the good Athenians to survive, to celebrate their victory, to be rewarded for their virtue. Instead, they vanish too, as if virtue alone isn't enough to save you from catastrophe once the forces of destruction are unleashed. The only thing that survives is the memory, the story, the lesson, not the people who learned it, not the civilization that embodied it, just the tale itself, warning future generations about the dangers of pride and power. Now, we need to step back and ask a fundamental question. Why did Plato write this story? What was he trying to accomplish by inventing Atlantis? Or, if he didn't invent it, by giving it such prominence in his dialogues? Because the answer to that question tells us a lot about how we should interpret the tale, and whether we should even be looking for a real Atlantis at all. Plato lived from approximately 427 to 347 years before the Common Era. He came of age in Athens during the catastrophic Peloponnesian War, the decades-long conflict between Athens and Sparta that ultimately resulted in Athens's defeat and humiliation. He was a student of Socrates, the philosopher who was executed by the Athenian state on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. These two experiences, the war and the execution of his teacher, profoundly shaped Plato's thinking about politics, morality, and the nature of justice. Much of Plato's work is dedicated to exploring a single question. What does a just society look like, and how can it be achieved? His most famous work, The Republic, lays out his vision in detail. A society governed by philosopher kings, where each person performs the role suited to their nature, where wisdom rules over passion and appetite, where justice means everyone doing what they're meant to do. It's a radical vision, deeply hierarchical, often uncomfortable to modern readers. But it represents Plato's attempt to solve the political crisis he saw all around him, the cycle of war and revolution and decay that seemed to characterize Greek city-states in his time. The Timaeus and Critias are, in a sense, sequels to the Republic. In the Timaeus, after Socrates summarizes his ideal state, he expresses a wish to see it in action, to watch it deal with real challenges. The Atlantis story is Plato's response to that request. He's trying to show what happens when an ideal state, like ancient Athens, faces off against a powerful but corrupt empire, like Atlantis. It's a thought experiment rendered as pseudo-history, using the structure of storytelling to explore philosophical concepts. The level of detail Plato provides about Atlantis makes sense in this context. He's not describing a real place. He's constructing an example, an illustration, showing in concrete terms what an empire based on wealth and power rather than wisdom and virtue looks like. All those precise measurements, the concentric rings, the irrigation system, the military quotas, they're not memories or historical records. They're the kind of specifics a philosopher creates when building an argument, when trying to make an abstract concept feel real and tangible to his readers. And the moral of the story is equally clear once you understand Plato's purposes. Atlantis represents everything Plato feared about the direction Athens was heading. The Athenian Empire of the 5th century before the Common Era had been a naval power, controlling trade routes and island colonies, extracting tribute and resources from subject peoples. It had grown wealthy and powerful, but that wealth and power had led to overreach, to the disastrous Sicilian expedition, and eventually to defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Plato saw in Athens's imperial ambitions the same kind of corruption he attributes to Atlantis, the pursuit of power for its own sake, the belief that might makes right, the gradual erosion of the civic virtues that had made Athens great in the first place. By contrast, ancient Athens in Plato's story represents what Athens could have been, or what he imagined it once was, a state governed by wisdom and virtue, able to defeat larger and wealthier enemies through superior organization and moral clarity. It's Athens as ideal republic, the kind of state Plato describes in his other works. The fact that this ancient Athens also gets destroyed in the catastrophe is telling. Plato seems to be suggesting that virtue alone isn't enough, that good states can still fall to natural disasters or bad luck, that the universe doesn't always reward the righteous. It's a more complex and darker view than simple moralism would suggest. There's also a strong element of critique of Athenian democracy in the Atlantis tale. The Atlantean government, with its 10 kings ruling by shared law and tradition, actually sounds somewhat like an idealized oligarchy, closer to Sparta than Athens. The fact that this system becomes corrupted suggests Plato's skepticism about any form of government that doesn't place wisdom, true philosophical wisdom, at its center. Even well-designed constitutions and sacred laws aren't enough if the people themselves become corrupted. This is a consistent theme in Plato's work: the necessity of wisdom in rulers, the danger of allowing power to fall into the hands of those driven by appetite or ambition rather than reason. Some scholars argue that Plato never intended Atlantis to be taken as history at all, that he expected his readers to recognize it as fiction from the start. The chain of transmission through multiple generations, the suspiciously perfect numbers and measurements, the obvious parallels to current events, all of this would have been recognized by educated Greeks as literary devices, signs that this was a parable rather than a genuine account. The fact that no other Greek writer mentions Atlantis before Plato, and that the Egyptian records Solon supposedly saw have never been found, supports this interpretation. Others suggest that Plato might have been working from some historical kernel, some story about a great flood or a destroyed civilization that he encountered through his extensive travels and studies. Perhaps he heard tales of the Minoan civilization on Crete, which had been destroyed centuries earlier by earthquakes and tsunamis. Perhaps he encountered stories about other ancient peoples whose cities had been lost to time. And perhaps he took these fragments and wove them into his philosophical allegory, creating something that was neither pure fiction nor pure history, but rather a blend of the two. The unfinished nature of the Critias also tells us something. Plato, by the time he wrote these dialogues, was an old man. He had been working on philosophical problems for decades. He had written the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, dozens of dialogues exploring every aspect of human life and thought. The Timaeus and Critias were late works, part of an ambitious trilogy that would have included a dialogue called Hermocrates, named after another character in these discussions. But he never completed Critias, and Hermocrates was apparently never even started. Perhaps he ran out of time. Perhaps he felt the point had been made. Perhaps he decided the story was less important than the underlying philosophy and saw no need to provide the dramatic conclusion. What we're left with then, is a philosophical work dressed up as history, a moral tale presented as an ancient account, a thought experiment given the texture of reality. Plato gives us just enough detail to make Atlantis feel real, just enough vagueness to prevent verification, just enough moral clarity to extract the lesson, and just enough ambiguity to keep people arguing about his intentions for the next 2,000 years. Whether he succeeded in his philosophical purposes is debatable. Few people remember the points about cosmic creation or ideal government that take up most of the Timaeus. But everyone remembers Atlantis. The example has overwhelmed the argument. The illustration has escaped the frame. And in doing so, it's taken on a life far stranger than anything Plato could have anticipated. Through the ages, how the legend grew. After Plato wrote about Atlantis, you might expect the story to have become a major part of classical mythology, discussed by every Greek and Roman writer, debated by philosophers, depicted in art and drama. But that's not what happened. For centuries, Atlantis was a minor footnote, a curious anecdote, mentioned occasionally, but never central to classical thought. The transformation of Atlantis into a cultural obsession came much later, through a series of reinterpretations, misunderstandings, and deliberate embellishments that added layer upon layer of new meaning to Plato's original tale. The ancient Greeks and Romans who wrote after Plato had mixed reactions to the Atlantis story. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, apparently didn't believe it was historical. He's credited with saying that Plato created Atlantis and then just as easily destroyed it, suggesting he saw it as a literary device. Other ancient writers occasionally mention the story, usually in discussions of geography or natural disasters, but without treating it as established fact. Strabo, the Greek geographer, thought it might be historical. Pliny the Elder mentioned it in his natural history. But overall, Atlantis remained what Plato had made it, a philosophical illustration, an interesting tale, not a major element of classical culture. Early Christian writers largely ignored Atlantis, probably because it didn't fit neatly into biblical chronology and wasn't relevant to theological debates. Medieval European scholars, when they encountered Plato's works at all, were more interested in his metaphysics and theory of forms than in his geographical descriptions. The Atlantis story didn't feature prominently in medieval thought, but it wasn't entirely forgotten either. It lingered in the margins of classical education, a curious story that some scholars knew about, but few took seriously. The Renaissance changed things. As classical texts were rediscovered, translated, and widely distributed through the new printing press technology, Plato's works became available to a broader audience. And Renaissance thinkers, fascinated by ideal societies and utopian visions, found the Atlantis story compelling for new reasons. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published in 1626, wasn't about finding Plato's island, but rather used the name and concept for his own vision of an ideal society based on scientific progress. Thomas More had done something similar earlier with his Utopia. These writers weren't claiming Atlantis was real. They were using it as a framework for thinking about how societies should be organized. But something else was happening during this period. European explorers were discovering lands Plato couldn't have known about. The Americas, the Pacific Islands, the vast spaces of the Atlantic Ocean. And some of these explorers and scholars began to wonder whether Atlantis might have been real after all. Maybe Plato's account was garbled or misunderstood, but perhaps it was based on actual places and events. Maybe the island beyond the Pillars of Hercules was actually America. Maybe Atlantis was a description of ancient American civilizations, their advanced cultures misremembered by European scholars who didn't realize how far west advanced societies had existed. This conflation of Atlantis with the Americas became surprisingly popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spanish chroniclers, trying to make sense of the advanced civilizations they encountered in Mexico and Peru, sometimes referenced Plato's story as a possible explanation. If Atlantis had been a mid-Atlantic continent, maybe it had connected Europe and America. And maybe Native Americans were descendants of Atlantean colonists. It was bad history and worse archaeology, but it was appealing in its way, fitting new discoveries into old frameworks. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as archaeology was emerging as a scientific discipline, the question of Atlantis started to take on new dimensions. Real lost civilizations were being discovered. Pompeii, buried under volcanic ash. Troy, revealed by archaeological excavation. Ancient Egypt, yielding its secrets to scholars who could finally read hieroglyphics. If these places, long thought mythical, turned out to be real, why not Atlantis? The scientific revolution hadn't killed interest in Atlantis. If anything, it had revived it, suggesting that ancient stories might contain genuine historical information waiting to be properly understood. The 19th century also saw the rise of pseudoscience and occult interest in Atlantis. Ignatius Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882, was enormously influential. Donnelly was an American politician and writer who became convinced that Atlantis was real and that it explained all sorts of cultural similarities between the old and new worlds. He argued that Atlantis was the original civilization, the source of human culture, the place where writing and agriculture and metalworking were first invented. When Atlantis was destroyed, he suggested, survivors fled east and west, carrying their knowledge to both sides of the Atlantic, which explained why Egyptian and Mayan pyramids look similar, why flood myths appear in so many cultures, why different civilizations had so many parallels. Donnelly's book was full of errors and speculative leaps, mixing genuine archaeological observations with wild theories and misinterpreted evidence. But it was also passionately written and exhaustively researched by the standards of its time. It took Atlantis from a classical footnote and made it a popular mystery, something everyone could talk about and speculate on. Suddenly, Atlantis was everywhere, in newspapers, in lectures, in popular books. The search for Atlantis became a cultural phenomenon, with expeditions launched, theories proposed, and claims made that grew wilder with each retelling. The occultists and spiritual movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries took Donnelly's ideas and ran with them. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, incorporated Atlantis into her elaborate mythology of human spiritual evolution. According to her teachings, Atlantis was one of several lost continents, where successive root races of humanity had developed. The Atlanteans, in her system, were spiritually advanced beings who fell from grace, much as Plato had suggested. But the details were now wrapped in mystical language and connected to reincarnation, karma, and spiritual evolution. The sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce in the early 20th century provided supposed psychic readings about Atlantis, describing it as a technologically advanced civilization with crystal power sources and advanced aircraft, destroyed when their technology went catastrophically wrong. These occult and mystical versions of Atlantis had almost nothing to do with Plato's original story anymore. They were new myths built on the name and basic concept, incorporating whatever elements fit the particular spiritual or philosophical system being promoted. Atlantis became a blank slate, a name that could mean whatever the writer wanted it to mean: lost wisdom, psychic powers, ancient aliens, spiritual enlightenment, technological hubris, you name it. Every generation, every movement, every theory could claim Atlantis as their own. By the mid-20th century, as plate tectonics revolutionized geology and underwater exploration became technologically feasible, many scientists concluded decisively that Atlantis, as Plato described it, couldn't have existed. There's no room for a continent-sized island in the Atlantic Ocean to have existed and disappear in any reasonable time frame. The ocean floor doesn't work that way. Continents don't sink. Islands don't vanish overnight. The geology simply doesn't support it. This should have ended the matter, scientifically at least, but it didn't. Instead, people just started proposing different locations, reinterpreting Plato's descriptions, arguing that he got the details wrong but the core story right. And so we arrive at the modern era, where Atlantis exists in a strange state. Academic scholars, for the most part, consider it a philosophical fiction, interesting for what it tells us about Plato's thinking, but not as a historical mystery to be solved. Yet popular culture remains fascinated. Books continue to be written. Documentaries continue to be made. Expeditions continue to search. Atlantis has become simultaneously fictional and real, a story everyone knows is made up, but many people still hope might contain some grain of truth. It's expanded far beyond Plato's original telling, incorporating elements from dozens of later traditions, theories, and reimaginings. The simple moral tale about hubris and divine punishment has become a vast mythology, a cultural commons where anyone can add their own ideas and interpretations. And none of it, absolutely none of it, would exist if Plato hadn't written those two dialogues about 2,300 years ago, dropping a single story into history, like a pebble into a pond, creating ripples that have never quite died away. The search intensifies. Where could it have been? If you decide, against all geological evidence and scholarly consensus, that Atlantis was a real place, then you immediately face a difficult question. Where was it? Plato said, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, larger than Libya and Asia combined. But no such island exists or could have existed in that location in any historically plausible time frame. So, if you want to find Atlantis, you have to reinterpret Plato's descriptions, argue that he got the location wrong, or had mistaken information, or was using symbolic geography rather than literal directions. And once you start down that road, Atlantis can be anywhere. And indeed, over the centuries, it has been placed just about everywhere. Let's start with the most straightforward interpretation. Atlantis was exactly where Plato said, in the Atlantic Ocean. This was the dominant theory for a long time. The Atlantic was called the Atlantic, after all, which seemed to confirm Plato's account. Various islands and underwater features have been proposed as possible locations, or remnants. The Azores, that volcanic island chain roughly 1,000 miles off the coast of Portugal, has been a favorite candidate. The islands sit on the mid-Atlantic ridge, a major tectonic boundary, and their volcanic nature suggests dramatic geological events in the past. Perhaps, some argue, the Azores are the mountain peaks of a larger landmass that sank when the sea floor spread or when volcanic activity reshaped the region. The problem with the Azores theory, like with any mid-Atlantic theory, is the geology. We now understand how the ocean floor forms and how continents move. The Atlantic Ocean has been widening, not narrowing, for hundreds of millions of years. No large landmass has sunk in the Atlantic in any time frame relevant to human history. The Azores have been steadily rising, not sinking, uplifted by volcanic activity. They're not the remnants of anything larger. They're exactly what they appear to be: volcanic islands that emerged from the seafloor and have remained relatively stable. Any theory that places Atlantis in the mid-Atlantic requires ignoring or rewriting everything we know about plate tectonics. Moving closer to land, some theories place Atlantis in the Caribbean, particularly around the Bahamas. In the 1960s, underwater formations near Bimini, dubbed the Bimini Road, sparked excitement among Atlantis seekers. The formations looked like walls or roads, seeming to show signs of construction, squares and rectangles too regular to be natural. Edgar Cayce had predicted that Atlantis would be found near Bimini, so his followers were particularly excited by the discovery. Unfortunately, geological analysis has shown that the Bimini Road is a natural formation, beach rock that fractured along regular patterns due to the way the stone was formed. It's interesting to look at, certainly, but it's not evidence of a lost civilization. The Caribbean location has other appeals, though. The region has experienced significant volcanic and seismic activity. Islands have formed and changed shape over geological time. The culture of the Caribbean before European contact was sophisticated in ways that might seem to echo descriptions of Atlantis. And the Caribbean is still technically beyond the Pillars of Hercules, just much further beyond than Plato probably meant. But again, there's no evidence of any large island civilization being destroyed there in any time frame that matches Plato's story. The native cultures of the Caribbean were maritime and sophisticated, but they don't match the details of Atlantis, and they certainly weren't destroyed in a single day and night. Then there's Antarctica, which sounds absurd until you hear the argument. The theory suggests that before the ice, when Antarctica was further north or the climate was warmer, it could have supported an advanced civilization. That civilization was Atlantis. When the climate changed, or when the Earth's crust shifted, as Charles Hapgood proposed in his books, Antarctica moved to its current position and froze, covering any evidence of habitation. It's a dramatic theory, supported by Albert Einstein's interest in Hapgood's work, and it ties into other fringe ideas about ancient advanced civilizations and cyclic catastrophes. The problem, of course, is that Antarctica has been where it is now for tens of millions of years, covered by ice for millions of years, far longer than humans have existed in anything like our current form. There was never a habitable Antarctica in any time period where humans could have built cities. Spain provides an interesting set of theories, particularly the region around Cadiz and the Doñana National Park. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of ancient structures, circles visible from aerial photography, evidence of tsunamis and floods in the region. The location is right, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but not far beyond them. There's evidence of sophisticated ancient settlements in the area, connected with the Tartessians, a people known from ancient texts but still somewhat mysterious. A tsunami event could have destroyed coastal settlements there, leaving them buried under sediment. The theory is more geologically plausible than mid-Atlantic locations, at least. The problem is that the scale doesn't match. Plato describes a massive island, a major empire. Southern Spain had settlements and coastal cities, but nothing on the scale Plato describes, and nothing that disappeared completely. Various Mediterranean locations have been proposed, each with its own merits and problems. The island of Malta, with its massive prehistoric stone temples, has been suggested. So has Sardinia, with its distinctive circular stone structures called nuraghi. Sicily, Crete, and Cyprus have all been nominated at various times. Turkey's western coast, particularly the region around Troy, has connections to the Atlas legend, and was certainly home to advanced Bronze Age civilizations. Each of these locations has actual archaeological evidence of ancient cultures, actual ruins to explore. But none of them match Plato's descriptions well, and all of them require reinterpreting the location, the size, the time frame, or multiple other details. Some theories get more creative, placing Atlantis in Bolivia, near Lake Titicaca. The argument here is based on similarities between the landscape around Titicaca and plus the presence of ancient ruins like Tiwanaku that show advanced construction. The theory suggests Plato got his geography confused, or that the story was garbled in transmission, and that beyond the Pillars of Hercules was a mistranslation or mistake. It's interesting in some ways, and Tiwanaku really is an impressive sight. But it's landlocked, at high altitude, and has no connection to the Mediterranean world in any plausible time frame. There are theories about Atlantis in the North Sea, buried under sediment and water. Theories about it being in the Black Sea, destroyed when the sea level rose and flooded low-lying areas. Theories connecting it to every ancient culture that built impressive architecture or had advanced technology for its time. Indonesia, India, the Richat structure in Mauritania, even locations in Asia have all been proposed by various researchers and enthusiasts. Each theory finds some detail in Plato that seems to match, and ignores or explains away the rest. The fundamental problem with all these theories, every single one, is that they require Plato to have been wrong about something. Wrong about the location, wrong about the size, wrong about the time frame, wrong about the details. At what point do you have to change so much of Plato's account that you're no longer looking for Atlantis at all, but just for any lost civilization that might vaguely affect a few descriptive details? And if you're willing to reinterpret everything Plato wrote, why believe the story has any historical basis in the first place? The truth is that Atlantis could be anywhere because it's probably nowhere. It's a story, carefully constructed by a philosopher to make a point. The details are vivid and specific because that makes the story more compelling, not because Plato was working from actual sources. The fact that no location quite fits is not a challenge to overcome through creative reinterpretation. It's evidence that we're looking for something that was never meant to be found, because it was never there to begin with. But people keep looking anyway. And perhaps that says something important about human nature, about our need to believe that lost wisdom and forgotten greatness might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered. But people keep looking anyway. And perhaps that says something important about human nature, about our need to believe that lost wisdom and forgotten greatness might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered. Santorini, the most convincing case? Of all the proposed locations for Atlantis, one stands out as the most historically plausible, the most archaeologically interesting, and the most likely to have inspired Plato's story in some way, even if it's not a perfect match. The island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. The connection between Santorini and Atlantis is compelling, not because it matches Plato's description exactly, but because it involves a real civilization, a real catastrophe, and real mysteries that touch on the same themes of hubris, destruction, and lost glory that run through the Atlantis story. Santorini today is one of the most beautiful islands in Greece, famous for its whitewashed buildings clinging to volcanic cliffs, its stunning sunsets, and its dramatic caldera, the water-filled crater left by one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. That eruption, which occurred around 1600 years before the Common Era, is central to the Atlantis connection. It didn't just reshape the island. It may have reshaped the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, destroying civilizations, triggering tsunamis, and leaving a mark on historical memory that could have echoed through centuries. Before the eruption, Santorini was called Thera, and it was a very different place. Instead of a crescent-shaped island with a caldera in the middle, it was roughly circular, a single large island dominated by a volcanic mountain. On this island flourished a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization, part of the broader Minoan culture, that was centered on Crete but extended throughout the Aegean. The settlement at Akrotiri, on Thera's southern coast, was one of the jewels of this civilization, a prosperous port town with multi-story buildings, advanced plumbing, beautiful frescoes, and all the signs of a wealthy, cultured society. Then, around 1600 years before the Common Era, the volcano erupted. Not a small eruption, not even a large eruption, but one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. Estimates suggest it was a magnitude 6 or 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, comparable to the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora or the eruption of Krakatoa. Tens of millions of tons of rock, ash, and pumice were ejected into the atmosphere. The center of the island literally exploded, collapsing into the emptied magma chamber below, creating the caldera we see today. Tsunamis radiated outward, devastating coastal settlements throughout the region. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean, covering crops and poisoning water supplies. The sky would have darkened, the temperature would have dropped. It was a catastrophe on a scale that ancient peoples would have struggled to comprehend. The Minoan civilization, which had been flourishing on Crete and throughout the Aegean, never fully recovered. Settlements on Crete were damaged by the tsunamis and earthquakes. The economy was disrupted. Trade networks were shattered. Within a few decades, the Minoans were in decline, their palaces falling, their power fading, eventually being absorbed or replaced by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. It was one of the great collapses of ancient history. A Bronze Age superpower reduced to ruins, remembered mainly through myth and archaeology. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Minoan civilization had many of the characteristics Plato attributes to Atlantis. They were a naval power, controlling trade routes and coastal settlements throughout the Aegean. They were wealthy, as evidenced by their elaborate palaces, sophisticated artwork, and extensive trade goods. They had advanced technology for their time, complex plumbing systems, multi-story architecture, impressive engineering. They had a unique writing system, Linear A, which we still can't fully decipher. And they were destroyed, relatively suddenly, by forces they couldn't control. The parallels aren't exact, but they're striking. Akrotiri itself provides some of the most compelling evidence. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 20th century, they found a town preserved much like Pompeii, buried under volcanic ash. The buildings were remarkably sophisticated. Multi-story structures with complex layouts, rooms organized by function, plumbing that included both freshwater and drainage. The frescoes on the walls depicted ships, dolphins, exotic flowers, elaborate ceremonies, showing a culture that was confident, prosperous, and connected to the broader world. The level of preservation is extraordinary because the ash buried everything so quickly and completely. What archaeologists didn't find at Akrotiri is almost as interesting as what they did find. There are no bodies, no skeletons of people caught by the eruption, no signs of panic or last-minute flight. This suggests the inhabitants had warning, perhaps from smaller earthquakes or early volcanic activity, and evacuated before the catastrophic eruption. Where they went, we don't know. Perhaps to Crete, perhaps to other islands, perhaps they were caught by tsunamis at sea. But the empty town speaks to an orderly abandonment. People taking their most precious possessions and leaving everything else behind.
The shape of Santorino today also somewhat echoes Plato's description. The caldera, with its rings of cliffs and water, could be seen as a natural version of those concentric rings Plato describes. Before the eruption, Thera might have had a roughly circular shape, perhaps with mountains and a central peak, somewhat like the island Plato describes. The hot springs that still exist around Santorino could correspond to the hot and cold springs Plato mentions. The fertile volcanic soil certainly matches descriptions of Atlantis's agricultural abundance. Of course, the differences are substantial too. Santorino is nowhere near the Atlantic Ocean. It's not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It's not larger than Libya and Asia. The time frame doesn't match either. The eruption happened around 1600 years before the Common Era, which would place it roughly 900 years before Plato, not 9,000. The Minoan civilization, while impressive, wasn't the massive empire Plato describes, didn't have armies of hundreds of thousands, didn't threaten all of Europe and Africa. The connections are suggestive, not definitive. But here's what makes the Santorino theory compelling. It provides a plausible explanation for how the story might have originated. Perhaps Plato, or his sources, heard tales about the Minoan civilization and its catastrophic end. Perhaps Egyptian priests really did have records of the Bronze Age civilizations and their collapse. Perhaps these stories, passed down and embellished over centuries, merged with philosophical ideas about ideal states and moral decline, becoming the foundation for Plato's fictional account. The Santorini eruption provides a real catastrophe, a real lost civilization, a real moment when an advanced culture was destroyed in what must have seemed like divine wrath. Some scholars suggest that Plato deliberately used the Minoan collapse as his inspiration, modifying and exaggerating the details to serve his philosophical purposes. He changed the location to the Atlantic because he wanted Atlantis to represent the Western power threatening from outside the Greek world. He increased the size and power to make the story more dramatic. He set it 9,000 years in the past to place it in a mythical time beyond verification. But the core idea, a prosperous civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe as punishment for growing too proud, could well have roots in actual historical memory of the Minoan collapse. The Santorino theory also reminds us that the ancients weren't just making things up from whole cloth. They had their own histories, their own records of past civilizations and catastrophic events. The Greeks remembered a time when Crete had been powerful and had then declined. They knew about tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. When Plato wrote about a great island civilization destroyed in a single day, his audience would have known such things were possible. They had seen it happen, if not in their own lifetimes, then in stories passed down from their ancestors. The physical evidence that yes, this happened, this was real, lends a weight to the Atlantis story that pure fiction couldn't achieve.
Today, Santorini is a major tourist destination, partly because of its natural beauty, but also partly because of its connection to the Atlantis legend. Visitors can tour the excavations at Akrotiri, walking through streets that haven't seen sunlight in 3.5 millennia. They can visit museums displaying the remarkable frescoes and artifacts recovered from the buried town. They can take boats out into the caldera and swim in the hot springs heated by the still active volcano below. And they can wonder, as millions have wondered before them, whether this beautiful, catastrophic island might hold the key to one of history's greatest mysteries. Whether Santorini is actually the inspiration for Atlantis remains debatable. Whether it matters is another question entirely. Because what Santorini demonstrates, beyond any doubt, is that the themes in Plato's story are real. Civilizations do rise to great heights. They do create remarkable art and architecture and technology. They do grow prosperous and powerful. And they can be destroyed suddenly and completely by forces beyond their control. The specific details of Atlantis may be fictional, but the warning it represents is absolutely true. And perhaps that's why the story endures, because it reminds us that what we build can always be lost, that nature is more powerful than human ambition, and that remembering our place in the world is more important than all the gold and orichalcum we might accumulate. Cultural legacy. Why we keep telling this story. Atlantis has escaped from Plato's dialogues and taken on a life of its own in human culture. For more than 2,000 years, writers, artists, filmmakers, and dreamers have returned to the image of the sunken city, reinterpreting it, reimagining it, using it to explore themes that resonate across time and culture. The fact that Atlantis probably never existed hasn't diminished its power. If anything, its fictional nature has made it more versatile, a blank canvas on which each generation can paint its own hopes and fears. In literature, Atlantis has been a constant presence since the Renaissance. We've already mentioned Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, but that's just the beginning. Jules Verne sent Captain Nemo to Atlantis in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, describing vast ruins on the ocean floor, columns and statues and buildings preserved beneath the waves. Verne's Atlantis was romantic, melancholy, a monument to lost glory. Later writers took different approaches. Some treated Atlantis as science fiction, a technologically advanced society whose inventions led to its doom. Others made it fantasy, a place of magic and mystery, where sorcerers wielded powers beyond modern understanding. In the 20th century, Atlantis became a staple of pulp fiction, appearing in adventure stories, in comics, in serialized novels. The plots were often similar. Explorers discover evidence of Atlantis, journey to find it, face dangers and challenges, and either find the lost city or just miss it. Sometimes they find descendants of the Atlanteans, survivors hiding in caverns beneath the sea or in secret valleys, preserving the old knowledge. Sometimes they find just ruins or crystals with strange powers, or artifacts that hint at once was.
The specifics varied, but the structure remained. The quest for lost wisdom, the hope that somewhere out there is knowledge we've forgotten. More serious literature has used Atlantis symbolically. The sunken city becomes a metaphor for whatever the writer thinks civilization has lost. Innocence, wisdom, harmony with nature, spiritual connection, social cohesion. It represents the golden age, that time before things went wrong, before we became corrupted or forgetful or divided. The appeal is universal, because every culture has some version of this story, some belief that once, long ago, things were better than they are now. Atlantis gives that vague nostalgia a name and a place, makes it concrete, even as it remains forever out of reach. In film and television, Atlantis has been everything from a serious historical mystery to pure entertainment. Disney's Atlantis, the Lost Empire, imagined it as a surviving underground civilization, still inhabited, still powerful, threatened by greedy surface dwellers. The film combines steampunk aesthetics with Plato's descriptions, creating a world that's visually stunning, even if historically nonsensical. The DC Comics underwater kingdom of Atlantis, home to Aquaman, takes the concept in a different direction. What if Atlantis didn't die, but adapted, sinking beneath the waves, but surviving? Its people evolving to breathe underwater and building a new civilization in the depths. Documentaries about Atlantis appear regularly on television, usually on channels devoted to history or mystery. They follow a predictable pattern, summarize Plato's account, interview experts who don't believe it was real, interview enthusiasts who do, show footage of underwater explorations or aerial surveys of supposed sites, present evidence that's always suggestive but never conclusive, and end with the mystery unsolved but intriguing. These documentaries know they're not going to find Atlantis. They're selling the search itself, the pleasure of speculation, the excitement of possibility. Video games have embraced Atlantis enthusiastically. It provides a ready-made setting for adventure, exploration, puzzle solving. Players can search for the lost city, discover its secrets, face its dangers. Sometimes Atlantis is presented historically, as something that might have existed. Sometimes it's pure fantasy, a magical kingdom with powers and creatures from myth. Sometimes it's science fiction, an advanced civilization whose technology still functions in the ruins. The flexibility of Atlantis as a concept makes it ideal for game designers. It's familiar enough that players immediately understand the premise, but vague enough that designers can fill in the details however they want.
The image of Atlantis has permeated popular culture in more subtle ways too. Any lost civilization, any sunken city, any reference to ancient wisdom or forgotten technology carries echoes of the Atlantis story. The very phrase, lost city, conjures up images of Atlantis, whether or not the writer or speaker is thinking about Plato's story specifically. It's become a cultural archetype, a shorthand for a particular set of ideas and emotions. Why does it endure? What is it about this particular story that has kept it alive for so long? Part of the answer is the universality of its themes. Every civilization fears decline and fall. Every culture has looked at the achievements of its ancestors and wondered if knowledge has been lost. The story of a great civilization destroyed by its own pride resonates because we see reflections of it everywhere in history. The Roman Empire fell. The Maya collapsed. Great powers rise and fall with regularity. Atlantis tells us this pattern is ancient, that we're part of a cycle that has played out before and will play out again. There's also something deeply appealing about the idea of lost wisdom. We like to believe that the ancients knew things we've forgotten, had access to knowledge or spiritual insights that our modern world has lost. It's comforting in a way. If the knowledge once existed, maybe we can find it again. Maybe we can reclaim what was lost. Atlantis represents the hope that somewhere out there, buried or sunken or hidden, is the key to understanding ourselves better, to solving problems that seem insolvable, to transcending our limitations. Never mind that this is almost certainly not true. The hope itself is valuable. The story also taps into environmental anxieties. Atlantis was destroyed by natural catastrophe, by forces its inhabitants couldn't control, despite all their technology and wisdom. In an age of climate change, rising sea levels, increasing natural disasters, that warning feels more relevant than ever. We are the Atlanteans, building our cities on coastlines, extracting resources from the earth, growing wealthy and powerful while ignoring the long-term consequences. The story whispers to us, remember what happened to them. And there's the simple pleasure of mystery. We live in an age where everything seems mapped, explored, known. There are no blank spaces left on the map. But the ocean floor remains largely unexplored. The possibilities, however remote, remain. Maybe, just maybe, something is down there. Maybe we haven't found everything yet. Atlantis represents the last great mystery, the possibility that despite all our satellites and sonar and submarines, something has escaped our notice. It probably hasn't, but the chance, however slim, is tantalizing. The story also taps into environmental anxieties. Atlantis was destroyed by natural catastrophe, by forces its inhabitants couldn't control, despite all their technology and wisdom. In an age of climate change, rising sea levels, increasing natural disasters, that warning feels more relevant than ever. We are the Atlanteans, building our cities on coastlines, extracting resources from the earth, growing wealthy and powerful while ignoring the long-term consequences. The story whispers to us, remember what happened to them. And there's the simple pleasure of mystery. We live in an age where everything seems mapped, explored, known. There are no blank spaces left on the map. But the ocean floor remains largely unexplored. The possibilities, however remote, remain. Maybe,
just maybe, something is down there. Maybe we haven't found everything yet. Atlantis represents the last great mystery, the possibility that despite all our satellites and sonar and submarines, something has escaped our notice. It probably hasn't, but the chance, however slim, is tantalizing. The academic response to this cultural phenomenon is fascinating. Scholars of Plato have spent decades explaining that Atlantis was fiction, that Plato never intended it to be taken literally, that the philosophical context makes this clear. But their explanations don't stop people from believing or searching. If anything, the scholarly consensus that Atlantis was fictional has only made the believers more determined, convinced they're onto something the experts have missed. It's a divide that's unlikely to be bridged, because the two sides are operating from different premises. Scholars see Atlantis as literature. Believers see it as coded history. And never the twain shall meet. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how Atlantis has become different things to different people, while remaining recognizably the same story. The New Age mystics who see it as a source of spiritual wisdom, the amateur archaeologists who analyze satellite photos looking for circular formations, the Hollywood producers who use it as a backdrop for adventure stories, the classicists who study it as an example of Plato's narrative techniques, they're all engaging with Atlantis. They're all finding meaning in the story, even if they disagree completely about what that meaning is. The legend has become big enough to contain all these interpretations, flexible enough to adapt to each new generation's concerns. And so Atlantis persists, not as history, not as fact, but as something more durable than either, as story, as symbol, as cautionary tale and eternal mystery. It's the city that never was, but will never be forgotten. The civilization that existed only in Plato's imagination, but has shaped the real world's culture for more than 2 millennia. In its way, that's a kind of immortality Plato himself might have appreciated. His philosophical works are read mainly by scholars, but his story about Atlantis, that belongs to everyone. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. The endless search. Why we still look. So here we are, more than 2,000 years after Plato wrote his dialogues, and people are still looking for Atlantis. Not just casual enthusiasts or fringe theorists, but serious researchers with funding and equipment using modern technology to scan ocean floors and analyze ancient texts. Expeditions are still launched. Documentaries are still filmed. Books are still written claiming to have finally solved the mystery. Why? What is it about this particular story that keeps drawing people back generation after generation, even though most scholars agree Atlantis never existed? Part of the answer lies in human nature itself. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We see connections even when they're not there. We find meaning in coincidence. When someone points out that the measurements of the Great Pyramid seem to encode mathematical constants, or that ancient sites around the world align in interesting ways, or that myths from different cultures,
there's also the appeal of being right when the experts are wrong. In our current age, when expertise itself is often questioned, the idea of proving the academic establishment wrong has a particular allure. If you can find Atlantis, if you can demonstrate that Plato was recording history rather than inventing philosophy, you've overturned centuries of scholarly consensus. You've shown that the experts missed something obvious. You've revealed yourself as someone who saw deeper or thought more clearly than all those professors with their degrees and publications. It's a seductive fantasy, the lone truth seeker triumphing over the hidebound establishment. Money plays a role too. Books about Atlantis sell. Documentaries about Atlantis get viewers. Archaeological expeditions, even ones looking for something that probably doesn't exist, can attract funding if they're presented well. There's an entire industry built around the search for Atlantis, employing researchers, writers, filmmakers, tour operators. Santorini markets itself as the possible site of Atlantis. Museums create exhibits. The economic incentive to keep the mystery alive is substantial. Not everyone involved is a true believer. Some are simply pragmatists who recognize that Atlantis is profitable. But beneath all these practical and psychological explanations, there's something deeper at work. The search for Atlantis is really a search for meaning, for connection to the past, for evidence that human civilization is more than just a brief spark in cosmic darkness. We want to believe we are part of a longer story. We want to believe that wisdom and greatness are possible, that they've existed before and could exist again. We want to believe that the ruins and fragments left by ancient peoples are clues to something more, not just the ordinary remains of ordinary lives, but signs pointing towards something extraordinary. Atlantis offers a narrative of loss and potential recovery. We had greatness once and lost it, the story goes. But maybe we can find it again. Maybe we can learn from their mistakes. Maybe their knowledge is still out there, waiting to be rediscovered. This narrative is powerful because it gives purpose to the present. We're not just living our lives, we're searching for lost truth. We're trying to reclaim forgotten wisdom. We're part of a quest that stretches back through time, connecting us to our ancestors and to humanity's larger story. The scientific arguments against Atlantis are comprehensive and conclusive. Plate tectonics doesn't allow for continent-sized islands to sink in the Atlantic. The archaeological record doesn't show any evidence of a civilization matching Plato's description. The historical sources outside of Plato don't mention Atlantis. The logical problems with Plato's account suggest he was creating fiction, not recording history. The lack of any physical evidence after centuries of searching speaks for itself. By any reasonable standard, the case is closed. Atlantis is fiction, interesting and influential fiction, but
fiction nonetheless. Yet the search continues, and perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the search itself serves a purpose, even if it's not the stated purpose of finding an actual lost city. The quest for Atlantis has motivated genuine scientific discovery. Underwater exploration, satellite imaging, archaeological techniques all have been advanced partly by people looking for Atlantis. They haven't found what they were looking for, but they found real ancient sites, real sunken settlements, real evidence of how humans lived and built and created in the past. The search for the imaginary has illuminated the real. The quest has also kept alive important questions about human civilization. How do civilizations fall? What causes collapse? Can we learn from the mistakes of the past? Are we heading toward our own catastrophe? These are questions worth asking, even if Atlantis itself is fictional. The story prompts us to think about the fragility of what we've built, the dangers of hubris and overreach, the importance of remembering where we came from. If Atlantis helps us think more carefully about our own civilization's trajectory, then maybe it doesn't matter whether the island itself existed.
There's also value in mystery for its own sake, in having questions that can't be definitively answered, possibilities that remain open. We live in an age that values certainty, that wants everything explained and categorized and understood. Atlantis resists that. It remains ambiguous, open-ended, unsolved. And maybe we need that. Maybe we need some mysteries that technology can't resolve. Some questions that remain unanswered despite our best efforts. They remind us that there are limits to knowledge, that some things remain beyond our grasp, that uncertainty is a permanent condition of existence. The cultural impact of Atlantis, the way it's inspired art and literature and exploration for millennia, is itself a kind of reality. Atlantis may not have existed as a physical place, but it exists as an idea, and ideas have power. The idea of Atlantis has shaped how we think about lost civilizations. It's influenced everything from archaeological theory to environmental policy to spiritual movements. It's given us a vocabulary for talking about decline and loss and the hope of recovery. In that sense, Atlantis is real, not as history, but as a living part of human culture, constantly being reimagined and reinterpreted for each new generation. And perhaps ultimately, the question of whether Atlantis existed misses the point entirely. Plato wasn't writing a geography textbook. He was writing philosophy, using story to explore ideas about justice and virtue and the nature of power. Whether the specific details were true was less important than whether the underlying truths they illustrated were valid. Is hubris dangerous? Do civilizations that forget virtue eventually fall? Can wealth and power corrupt even well-designed institutions? These are the questions Atlantis was meant to explore, and they remain urgent today. The search for Atlantis, then, is really a search for ourselves, for understanding our own nature and our own civilization. We project onto the lost island our hopes and fears, our ideas about what makes a society great and what causes it to fall. When we imagine finding Atlantis, we're really imagining finding answers to questions about our own future. Will we be remembered as a great civilization? Will we fall? What will cause our collapse if it comes? What would future generations need to know to avoid our mistakes? These are heavy questions, almost too heavy to think about directly. But wrapped in a story about a sunken island, they become manageable. We can explore them at a distance, safely, examining civilizational collapse in the abstract rather than confronting our own mortality and impermanence head-on. Atlantis gives us a way to think about the unthinkable, to imagine catastrophe without having to fully acknowledge that we're imagining our own. And so the search continues, not because there's good reason to think Atlantis will be found, but because the search itself serves psychological, cultural, and even philosophical purposes that have nothing to do with the actual historical reality. We look for Atlantis because looking connects us to the past, because it gives us hope that lost knowledge can be recovered, because it reminds us to be humble in the face of forces larger than ourselves, because it's exciting and mysterious and beautiful to imagine. We look because humans are searchers by nature, and some things are worth searching for even if we never find them. The endless quest for Atlantis is a mirror held up to humanity itself. What we seek in the sunken city is what we seek everywhere: meaning, connection, wisdom, and the hope that we're part of something larger than our individual lives. Whether we find it or not, the searching changes us. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the real treasure hidden in Plato's story all along. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the history of Atlantis. From Plato's philosophical dialogues to modern expeditions searching the ocean floor, from Renaissance utopias to Hollywood blockbusters, from Santorino's excavations to Antarctica's ice. We've traced how a story meant to illustrate political philosophy became one of humanity's most enduring mysteries. We've seen how it's been reinterpreted by each generation, adapted to new contexts, used to explore new concerns. And we've tried to understand why, against all evidence and reason, people keep searching. The truth about Atlantis is probably simple. Plato made it up. He created a fictional civilization to serve as an example in his philosophical arguments. The details were vivid because he was a skilled writer, not because he was recording history. The story persists because it touches on universal themes, because it's beautiful and tragic and compelling, because it offers both warning and hope. That's the prosaic truth, the scholarly consensus, the conclusion most experts have reached. But there's another kind of truth in the Atlantis story, one that has nothing to do with historical accuracy, It's the truth of myth, of archetype, of the deep structures of storytelling that reveal something about human nature. Atlantis teaches us about hubris and its consequences. It reminds us that civilizations are fragile, that what we build can be lost, that pride and power corrupt. These lessons remain valid whether or not the specific story is factual. In fact, they may be more powerful precisely because they're presented as story rather than sermon. Plato, that philosopher, writing in Athens 23 centuries ago, could never have imagined what his throwaway illustration would become. He couldn't have predicted the expeditions and excavations, the books and films, the theories and debates. He couldn't have known that his fictional island would become more famous than anything else he wrote, that people would take it more seriously than they took his actual philosophical arguments. The story escaped his control, took on a life of its own, became something bigger than he intended. And in a way, that's fitting. Stories do that. The best ones always do. They mean more than their authors planned. They resonate in ways that can't be predicted. They adapt and evolve and survive. So whether you believe Atlantis was real or fictional, whether you see it as coded history or pure invention, whether you're a serious scholar or a casual dreamer, the story has something to offer. It's a mirror for examining our own civilization's trajectory. It's a canvas for projecting our hopes about what humanity might achieve, and our fears about how it might fall. It's a reminder that mystery and wonder still exist in the world, that some questions remain open, that the past still has secrets to yield. And it's a beautiful story, regardless of its truth, worth retelling and reimagining for as long as humans tell stories to each other. The lights are low now. Your eyes are heavy. And somewhere deep beneath the waves, whether in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, or only in imagination, the ruins of Atlantis wait in the dark, just as they've waited for thousands of years. The columns still stand in the minds of dreamers. The concentric rings of land and water still ripple outward through culture and memory. The warning still echoes. Remember hubris. Remember fall. Remember that all we build is temporary, and that wisdom matters more than wealth. The story isn't over. It never ends, not really. As long as civilizations rise and fall, as long as humans wonder about the past and worry about the future, as long as we dream of lost wisdom and golden ages, Atlantis will be there, just out of reach, just beneath the surface, waiting to be found by those brave or foolish enough to look. Sweet dreams. And if you found this story about the eternal mystery worth your time, consider subscribing to this channel for more historical tales told in just this way. We'll be here, exploring the boundary between history and myth, fact and fiction, the real and the imagined, helping you drift off to sleep with stories that have captivated humanity for centuries. Until next time, rest well, and remember, the greatest mysteries are the ones that teach us something about ourselves.